Hello, everyone. My name is Maura McGinty-Kloss. I'm Chief Operating Officer of the Ethics and Compliance Initiative, and I want to thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Ethics and Compliance in Performance Reviews. This presentation was developed by one of ECI's peer-based working groups who worked for many months in committees and in discussion by monthly meetings to create the deliverable that we're presenting today. If you are not familiar with ECI's working groups, they are open to all organizational members and above. We do have a large list of the opportunities and topics that your peers are talking about and working challenges to resolve, and would love to have your participation. Please feel free to contact Casey, who is also on this call, casey@ethics.org, and she's happy to connect you with the working group of your interest. We will be using the Zoom platform today, as you know. If you're having any trouble with connections, please email casey@ethics.org, CASEY@ethics.org, and she will help you out. If you want to click participants on the bottom of the screen, a sidebar will appear with all participants, and you are able to raise your hand at the bottom of the right corner if you would like to speak. Today's webinar, just as a reminder to everyone, is being recorded so that it is available for members after today's presentation. Our agenda will be as follows. We'll introduce our speakers, we'll have our presentation, and then some open discussion, conclusions, and remarks. So joining us today are two co-chairs of the ENC Employee Performance Review Working Group, Bob Mascola and Kim Kaminsky of BAE Systems. So I will let them introduce themselves when I pass the microphone over, and then two members of their working group, Tiffany Butler from World Concern and Marissa Montoya of the Endurance International Group. So at this point, I will turn the microphone over to Bob and Kim.
Great, thanks, Maura. Really appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our discussion today. The information that we are presenting is really a culmination of efforts from our 10-member working group, and we'd like to thank Mike Camilleri, Christina Irvin, Douglas Cotton, Reagan Hine, Rachel Gerstein, and Hal Foe, in addition to our other presenters today, Marissa Montoya, Bob Mascola, and Tiffany Butler. Everyone did a yeoman's job in researching to generate the best practices paper that can be found on the ECI website. Please change the slide, Casey. So the objective of the ECI best practices paper was really to provide practical recommendations on how to better leverage performance evaluation systems and related compensation systems, PES, to positively incentivize ethical behavior. We have 5 recommendations that we'll be reviewing as part of the presentation today. Most organizations are better at punishing misconduct than at rewarding ethical conduct. Organizations with even a basic ethics and compliance program typically have established processes that govern how allegations of misconduct are investigated and how to hold accountable those found to have engaged in misconduct. Fewer organizations have a strategy to reward or positively incentivize behavior that lives up to the values of the organization. Nearly all the members of the working group and the ethics and compliance professionals that we spoke with as part of the research reported this was an area that needing improvement in their organization. The research the team conducted looked at transforming state of the performance evaluation systems, enforcement agency positions, and other subject matter experts in the ENC space. Performance evaluation systems are only one item in our ENC toolbox to incentivize ethical behavior. An organization's code of conduct, training and communication, risk assessment, and audit processes are equally important but these were outside the scope of our research. Next slide, please. So the performance evaluation systems are transforming. Annual or semi-annual performance reviews based on cascading goals and forced or quasi-forced distribution of employee performance ratings still do play an important role in many organizations, but a system of continuous feedback is becoming more popular. And I can talk more about that if we've got time at the end of our Q&A. There's a shift from talking about people to a practice of talking with people, from performance appraisal to performance development, and from ranking employees to fostering teamwork. A potential drawback for the continuous feedback is that we may miss the benefits of the longer-term time horizon. Most recently, some have argued for an entirely new approach to performance appraisal and compensation decisions, noting that performance targets and bonus pay are not only ineffective motivators, but can be destructive. In their book, Prime to Perform, authors Neil Doshi and Lindsay McGregor argue that organizations reach top performance when employees enjoy what they do, when they value their work's impact, and when they can increase their potential through their work, and when negative motivators, emotional, economic pressure, and inertia are minimized. The authors call this total motivation, or short, TOMO. Direct motives typically increase performance, and indirect motives typically decrease it. The more directly connected the motive is to the activity itself, the better performance becomes. How to best leverage an organization's performance evaluation system to improve an E&C culture will really vary depending on the system the organization uses. For organizations using cascading objectives to set annual performance targets that measure end-of-year performance, it's crucial that E&C professionals work to formally integrate ethics and compliance into these defined objectives. On the other hand, where organizations use a system of frequent conversations for evaluation and feedback, it may be more important to focus on training people managers on how to meaningfully integrate ethics and compliance into those discussions. Finally, organizations structure around the new learnings on motivation will want to emphasize how ethical behavior makes employees feel good about their work, helps define their work's purpose, and ultimately helps them to reach their potential. In addition, organizations that incorporate bonus pay into the PF, it is important to consider the role of ethics and compliance factors will have in determining whether a bonus should be given and how big it is. Next slide, please. Taking a look at the legal and external standards, evolving legal and professional standards are raising the bar for compliance programs generally, and this is true in incentivizing ethical conduct. Chapter 8 of the U.S. Federal Sentencing Guidelines set forth the 7 elements of an effective compliance program. An effective compliance program requires organizations to both exercise due diligence to prevent and detect criminal conduct, and otherwise promote an organizational culture that encourages ethical conduct and a commitment to compliance with the law. To meet these objectives, organizations must meet standards in 7 areas, one of which requires getting both discipline and positive incentives right. You can see the highlighted wording from section 8B 2.1 in the slide. In March of 2017, the fraud section of the U.S. Department of Justice issued a guidance document entitled Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Programs, which picked up on this theme. In evaluating compliance programs in criminal investigations, the fraud section may ask about incentives. The United States is not alone in focusing on incentive systems to evaluate compliance programs. In 2010, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, published its good practice guidance on internal controls, ethics, and compliance, which included 12 recommendations for organizations, including 1, encouraging positive support for the observance of ethics and compliance programs or measures against foreign bribery at all levels of the company. In addition, the ISO standard on anti-bribery management systems, ISO 37001, which was published in 2017, makes the point that personal evaluations, promotions, bonuses, and other rewards could be used as incentives for personnel to perform in accordance with organizations' anti-bribery policy and anti-bribery management system. And now I will hand it over to Marisa Montoya, who will finish up the legal and external standards and go over our first recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. I'm Marisa, and the last external standard that we took a look at was the ECI Blue Ribbon Panel Report, Principles and Practices of High Quality Ethics and Compliance Programs. You can grab this in exchange for your name and email address on the ECI website. Just Google it to get there. The panel reviewed printed literature, including regulatory commentary, held panel discussions, and welcomed public comment while they were putting this report together. It was published in April of 2016 and provides 5 principles of high quality programs known as HQP. For the purposes of this presentation, we focused on Principle 3, which states, leaders at all levels across the organization build and sustain a culture of integrity. Warren Buffett has a real penchant for culture and integrity. He expects the highest standards of his staff, and this quote sums it up nicely. Lose money for the firm and I will be understanding. Lose a shred of reputation for the firm and I will be ruthless. So this really focuses on culture and lets the employees know where they also need to shine. So what does the research say about leadership and culture? It says that leaders are the primary driver of culture. Culture is understood to be the largest influencer of business conduct. It's the way we do things around here. So if a new hire comes out of class, they sit down next to their coworker and the coworker says, forget everything you learned in training, I'm going to tell you how we really do it around here. That just undermined every good ethical point that was made in the new hire training. Employees who perceive that their leaders act with integrity are more likely to speak up and act with integrity themselves. So we want to expect that our leaders not only act with an integrity, but they also use their leadership position to promote the integrity. And the leading practice is to not only expect this behavior of our leaders, but to measure them on this. So I am interested if any of you are currently measuring this, and perhaps you can chime in either in the chat or in the comment section as we get to the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. All right, so as Kim mentioned, we have 5 recommendations that we outlined in our paper. And the first one is measuring the how, not just the what. So as you are familiar with a typical performance evaluation system, you're measuring your KPIs. So what has the employee accomplished? Now, the leading practice is also to evaluate the how achievements were accomplished. So you can look to see if their accomplishments were in line with the stated values. Were they in line with the code of conduct and the compliance policies? I'm sure you've all heard of the example where perhaps a manager doesn't hold the highest sales agent accountable to the ethical standards that they hold others to. So that's an area where they're not looking at the how, just the what. So we want to create a culture and an environment where there are no ethical waivers for top salespeople, executives, or anybody for that matter. So leaders at all levels model integrity by talking about the importance of ethical conduct and referencing organizational values during decision making. So when they're put in a tough scenario, they can look to the values, look to the code, and use those resources to help them think through what the right resolution is. And employees will notice that. Also, exemplifying, Also exemplifying the conduct they expect of their employees. So, sorry, I just got a note that I should talk louder, so I hope this is louder. Actually, maybe that's too. Okay, well, I'm going to go with it does. Okay, so ethics and compliance is central to business strategy, and that is what a high quality program, that's what was demonstrated in this Blue Ribbon report. So when a leader is not measuring the how, this leads to mixed messaging that undermines the culture of integrity because they're perhaps giving ethical waivers. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so continuing measuring the how is what we're recommending. So we all have heard the carrot and the stick example, and the stick is punishing employees for not doing the right thing. So maybe they get investigated and then they get a written warning or they're terminated. The carrot is where we want to be going. That's the wave of the future. So rewarding employees for positive behaviors, giving them the carrot. So there's a few steps when you're actually trying to make this into a reality. First, you want to understand your organization's performance management philosophy. So is your company embracing a formal annual review where you fill out a form and you submit it to HR and it gets uploaded into the system? Or, as Kim alluded to, is yours perhaps more informal? There is no form, or maybe you can write it out however you want and you touch base with your employees every month on these particular goals. So you need to understand what is the current today's process and what does your company currently support. It's going to be difficult to ask. It's going to be a difficult ask if you go to HR and your idea is way off the mark with what's currently being done. And of course, just like with all business interactions, having an existing relationship and understanding with your HR partner makes this discussion easier and ensures that they can understand the why of your ask. So once you understand your organization's philosophy, the next thing you want to do is develop a concrete proposal. So in the actual paper, the white paper, there's a long list of questions that you can answer to start generating your proposal. A few of those are, what are the key behaviors you're trying to promote and how do they relate to your organization's risks? Who is your target audience? Are you starting with a C-suite? Are you starting with managers? Or are you going all in and you're going to try it out with all employees? What kinds of hard and soft metrics are you looking at? Is this data that you're looking to collect even available? How can it be collected? And who's going to actually assess the data? So that will help you put your proposal together. One thing to consider when you're putting your proposal together is simplicity versus complexity. So complex measurements may be more precise in incentivizing behaviors, but simple ones require fewer resources and may be easier to sell and implement. So you want to make sure that you are striking a balance. You don't want to come with a whole revamp of the performance review. Maybe start small, get one, two items or line items that you can focus on ethics and compliance and see how that works, analyze, talk it through, and then maybe add on if that makes sense. And then finally, once you've got all of your ducks in a row, you're going to sell your proposal to the senior leadership and HR. And these are some of the typical selling points of an ethics and compliance program, but it's still good to remind
our senior leaders and our HR business partners. So having an ethical culture is strongly linked to employee engagement, retention, innovation, and commercial success. So the bottom line there. So that's a win-win for everybody, hopefully. A well-designed performance evaluation system promotes ethical behavior and helps leaders promote an ethical culture. And finally, the external sources. So the Department of Justice and other enforcement agencies actually expect companies to adopt systems that positively promote ethics and compliance. And as I mentioned before, a lot of us have the stick, but we don't have the incentive part down just yet. So this will move you in that direction. So ethical messages are reaching employees in many ways, as you all know: observable behavior, policies, the code, emails, and we're proposing that performance evaluations be one other way to enforce your ethical culture. And we'll have the next slide, please, and then turning it over to Bob.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to go over the second and third recommendations. So the second recommendation that we came up with is that ethics and compliance professionals should advise the business in defining and communicating the organization's or the business unit's objectives or targets to ensure that they are not misaligned with the organization's value and commitment to ethics and compliance. And in some ways, I think this is the area where organizations have a lot of work to do, because from what we've seen, there are not many companies that are far along in this particular area. When we came up with this, we began with looking at the long list of negative headlines about companies in crisis. So you're all familiar with the Wells Fargo case, where the CEO famously set a target of 8 is great, referring to 8 accounts as the objective for the retail banks to open up for each client, and that objective got cascaded down all the way to the retail branch level, where it wreaked havoc and led to widespread fraud and ultimately over 5,000 employees being terminated. But it's not just Wells Fargo. You have the Volkswagen diesel dupe case, which is also linked to a very large stretch objective for Volkswagen to become the largest automotive maker in the world. You have the case of Kobe Steel, which had very strict quality standards on its steel and copper, and they were so strict that in order to comply with them, employees felt like they had to fabricate test results. And we will see what happens with the Boeing 737 scandal that we're all reading about now, but there are already articles about the pressure that the company was under to deliver this in a timely manner, and we'll learn whether or not they were key targets or objectives that are at the root of that current crisis. It would be, the idea is that as ethics and compliance professionals, if we know that these objectives can be so disruptive, can we get ahead of the curve and deal with them at the beginning by getting involved in the process of setting the objectives? Because we know that big objectives, stretch objectives, whatever you want to call them, can have unintended consequences, as they have had repeatedly, as indicated in these cases and many others. So we want to have a role in setting the targets, or at least in highlighting the potential consequences. Now, how we have a role is going to vary from one company to another. There are many ways to have a role, but the important point is that ethics and compliance at some level should be involved, or the best practice would be that ethics and compliance is involved in setting the targets. And in fact, some government agencies are now highlighting the importance of oversight of the incentive systems, and this is particularly true in financial services. Following the 2008 crisis, research was showing that part of the reason that we got to the crisis that we got to is because the incentive structures in place really led employees to make unacceptable risks. So what the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has issued in 2016 is some guidance on performance incentives. And I'm going to read to you what they write. It's in the report. It says, despite their potential benefits, incentive programs can pose risks to consumers, especially when they create an unrealistic culture of high-pressure targets. When such programs are not carefully and properly implemented and monitored, they may create incentives for employees or service providers to pursue overly aggressive marketing, sales, servicing, or collection tactics. The CFPB expects supervised entities that choose to utilize incentives to institute effective controls for the risk these programs may pose to consumers, including oversight of both employees and service providers involved in these programs. So there you have an agency saying how important it is to have oversight of the use of incentives, by extension, use of performance evaluations. And at one conference, ECI conference, we had a representative from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau speak to us and was very excited about how the ethics and compliance community was working to integrate ethics and compliance into performance evaluation systems. Now, how to have, when you're advising, there are certain ways that you can structure incentives to address the risk of unintended consequences. And in the paper, there are there's an excerpt from the Goals Gone Wild article that came out in 2009. It was a Harvard Business Review article by Lisa Ordonez at the University of Arizona. And you should look at that and read the entire article because even though it is now 10 years old, it is still exceptionally relevant and useful. And it has a framework for analyzing objectives and the risks of unintended consequences that may come from using objectives. So I'm just going to highlight a few of them. So are the goals too challenging? What will happen if the goals are not met? And how will employees and outcomes be evaluated? That's one thing. Another thing to look at is who is setting the goals. Are they set from above or are they set collectively? And do the people who are working to achieve a goal, do they have a role in setting the goal? And if they do, they may be more likely to respect the goal and maybe less inclined to cheat in order to achieve it. You might ask whether or not intrinsic motivation to do something in a certain way might be lessened by having a formal target or KPI. So these are all things that you can consider, but in general, look to the article and the framework provided there. And I think that when you're working with your business colleagues and setting KPIs and trying to get them to understand the unintended consequences, this framework you will find very helpful. Next slide, please. So the third recommendation that we came up with is that E&C professionals should partner with human resources to ensure that measuring the how includes a fair assessment of desired E&C behaviors. And we use the word here, the art of measuring the how, because it really is an art. There's not a right way to measure the how. And we do have to approach this with a bit of humility. And there's a nice quote that sums it up, which is that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. So we approach this knowing that it is a difficult area. But the starting point is the values that the company has, because it's fairly common these days that organizations will integrate their values into their performance evaluation system. So if they have honesty or collaboration as some of their stated values, that is often incorporated into the performance evaluations. So that means at the very outset that E&C should have a role when organizations are redoing their values. You don't want to be in a position where one part of your organization, HR, is in a corner coming up with values and then presenting them, and you don't have an opportunity to participate. But once the values are out there, the question is, how do those values tie to the desired ethics and compliance behaviors that you're looking for? And it's not always obvious, depending on the value. It could be quite clear. But the idea is that the ethics compliance professionals can help in partnering with HR to clarify how those values look like in terms of ethics and compliance. So I would recommend that you go through the values, make sure it's clear what the behaviors are that are associated with each value, and highlight those that are consistent with the culture of integrity. Some of those I said will be easier, like, as an example, integrity or honesty are values, and those are clearly central to a culture of integrity. But having those as a value that is used for performance evaluation also runs some risks that you have to be aware of and mitigate against. Because if all you're asking someone to do is evaluate whether or not someone on their team is a person of integrity, it puts them in a difficult position, and you want to avoid a situation where everyone is just getting top marks in a check-the-box fashion, because that ultimately undermines the whole process and the whole idea of having a value of integrity. But other values might have very unclear connections to ethics and compliance, and you have to think about it and come up with a way to communicate the connections to ethics and compliance. So an example would be if a company has as a value innovation or entrepreneurship, which is becoming common as we all try to emulate the dot-com Silicon Valley companies. What is the connection to ethics compliance? In some ways, these values can, at one end, work against a value of ethics and compliance, because somebody who's creative or who's entrepreneurial might find ways to do things, or creative ways to do things, even if it violates the rules. On the other hand, you can highlight that entrepreneurship or creativity or innovation means creating an environment where you're welcoming of new ideas, fostering a speak-up culture. That is an example of a behavior that is aligned with ethics and compliance. Some companies have also taken additional approaches to integrate ethics and compliance values into the performance evaluations. Some companies have done 360 evaluations, so that it's not only a supervisor who's evaluating an employee, but also colleagues and subordinates. And particularly when you're looking at ethics and compliance behaviors, you really would like to get a complete picture. So a 360 review has a role. And then other companies have had the practice of requiring, for those organizations that have that require employees to set objectives at each year, some companies require that one of those objectives be ethics and compliance related. And there are pros and cons to doing that, but requiring an ethics and compliance objective sends the signal that the company is serious about ethics and compliance. And your role in that case would be to help employees come up with an appropriate and meaningful ethics and compliance target. So there are many ways of doing this, but the bottom line is when we're partnering with HR, we have to approach this with humility, but the objective is to help the organization's supervisors and others who are giving performance reviews, help them to make their performance assessment in a way that's aligned with a culture of integrity. So now I'm going to hand it over to Tiffany to take us through the remaining recommendations.
Thank you, Bob. So hello, Tiffany here with World Concern. I will be discussing our fourth and fifth recommendations. Our fourth recommendation discusses a focus on holding leaders accountable. So efforts to incentivize ethical conduct starts with the senior leaders. They play a key role in shaping company culture. Leaders shape the company culture from the inside, the effects of which are felt by all employees. So beyond internal effects, a company's culture can bring about external consequences. For example, enforcement agencies expect senior leaders to contribute to building and sustaining a culture of integrity. It's not only enforcement agencies who expect senior leaders to contribute to the culture of ethics, but also the general public is demanding that senior leaders set the tone from the top. So the bottom line is that leaders are held to a higher standard both internally and externally. There are various ways that one can measure E&C leadership and keep leaders accountable. So two of the most common ways that we looked at in measuring E&C leadership and accountability are assessing trainings and communications. For trainings, each training can capture completion rates and are automatically assigned to a predetermined audience. Completion rates can be harder to capture for live trainings, but one solution is to limit the evaluation of participation rates to the important and risk mitigating training priorities for the year. For example, this can include trainings on the code of conduct or supervisor-led discussions on ethical scenarios. Another training metric to consider, among others, is to assess the post-training knowledge retention rates through follow-up questions, either through online assessments or during performance check-ins. Concerning communications, leaders can be assessed on the output of their consistent and visible communications that support company values and a company's code of conduct. Some companies even set a predetermined number of E&C communications for the year as an objective target for the leader to accomplish. A leader can naturally integrate unplanned and unscripted E&C communications and messages into business conversations, or a leader can push out these formal communications. When they are unplanned and unscripted, it is harder for a company to measure the impact. One way to capture these is exampled in the World Concern case study. So our organization does ask leaders to discuss during their performance evaluations what they've done in the last year to instill the mission, vision, and values in their team. This allows them to discuss these less formal communications and let them bubble to the top. Planned formal communications to support E&C are indeed easier to measure, but may be less impactful when separated from the daily real-time business conversations. Another way a company can measure E&C leadership is through cultural metrics, for example, employee survey results. Employee surveys can be utilized to assess the leader's performance. These surveys should include E&C questions. For example, do the employees feel comfortable in reporting incidents and in speaking up with the leader? If a company chooses to assess cultural metrics through surveys, these must be utilized on a consistent schedule in order to avoid the unreliability of metrics, as culture is shaped gradually over time, and a leader's good work and the employee's assessment of it may be overshadowed by anomalous events if surveyed at random. Also, compliance helplines and case management data can measure E&C leadership. These can provide useful data points for a leader's performance. The number of compliance violations in an area, whether in absolute terms or on a per 100 employee basis, can provide a measure, can reveal a measure of the organization's health. So controls and risk assessment metrics are also an indicator of E&C leadership. This entails the creation of a strong controls environment, including assessing, one, the area under the leader's responsibility has timely closed all audit findings. Two, agreed mitigation measures have been identified in the risk assessment process and were timely implemented. And three, that a leader gives opportunities for E&C professionals to present at staff or management meetings. Finally, ad hoc observations can assess the E&C leadership. For example, evaluations can consider how leaders handle tough calls from investigation findings and how they respond towards the inappropriate conduct of others. The ad hoc nature of such observations makes them difficult to use in a systematic way, which is something to be aware of. Therefore, a triangulation of information sources is necessary. and ad hoc observations can supplement a more data-driven metric. So all considered, once the core E&C metrics and tools for assessment are identified, they should be translated into performance objectives and formally integrated into the performance evaluation process. Next slide, please. There are some other alternative approaches to consider. Companies can require E&C targets for leaders, which can vary to focus resources on specific areas needing attention. The target E&C metric can change to address particular needs or gaps, and can also vary from one department or function to another to address group-specific issues. Besides selecting the core metrics for assessing leadership performance, organizations must decide whether and how to link performance assessments to compensation. More senior leaders are likely to already have these incentives as part of their compensation. And different companies can take different approaches to using this bonus to incentivize ethical leadership. Some formal links between E&C performance and bonus pay have both pros and cons. Some pros include bonuses can incentivize desired behaviors. Cons are, as Kim mentioned earlier, financial incentives are less powerful and than intrinsic motivations can be. So informal channels without compensation links can include a self-assessment supported by objective data to keep E&C goals out in front without a financial incentive. Our report discussed a case study concerning a large multinational company where the E&C department provides senior leaders with 3 questions to include in performance review discussions with their leadership team. The questions are shared in advance with the leadership team so that they could take action during the year and would be prepared for them in the future discussions. E&C also provided senior leaders with some data before their one-on-one discussions as a point of reference in the discussion. Next slide, please. So our final recommendation, recommendation 5, discusses formal and informal rewards. Companies can consider using an employee recognition program for exemplary E&C performance, but be aware that public recognition can present challenges. For example, rewarding employees for exemplary E&C behavior may have the unintended consequence of showing that desired ethical behavior is uncommon and exceptional, which can denormalize E&C behaviors. And especially for global companies, leaders should also be aware of any cultural taboos against public recognition. Informal non-public recognition includes face-to-face expressions of gratitude, which can be quite powerful. For example, organizations can encourage employees who speak up. Taking the time to thank those can be very rewarding for the employee, especially if a thank you comes from the senior person. We cannot expect senior leaders to thank all those who raise concerns, but where an employee has demonstrated particular courage in raising an issue, or where an employee's report helps to save the company from larger legal or reputational issues, a leader's personalized and authentic expression of appreciation can have a significant impact. So those are our recommendations in our report, and so that concludes our time, but would love to hear from those in the audience for a discussion. So are there any questions to start us off?
Maura, this is Bob. Do you want to just review how employees can raise questions using the platform?
Casey, do you want to, since you're managing that, do you mind doing that?
Yeah. So if you are on your computer, you want to click participants at the bottom of the screen. A sidebar will appear with all the participants. Then you want to click raise hand at the bottom right corner. And then if you're just on your phone, if you do *9, you are able to raise your hand and I can call on you. but I will start with one question. How much or what percentage of a pay increase is reasonable when linked to E&C performance?
Yes, hi, Tiffany. I hear a little bit of an echo. I hope it's not too loud on your side. Yeah, so it sounds like the question was how much or what percentage of pay increase is reasonable when linked to E&C. So this can vary from company to company, but we do have a case study in section 3 about Emergent Biosolutions shared that they give equal weight to the what and the how in any performance-based pay increases. So not all of 50% would be integrity related specifically, but it is part of it. And other than that, I think the biggest import is that it's structured, it's consistent, so that it's perceived as fair. I think the biggest issue is that you don't want to you don't want to have those decisions being made in a black box where employees at different levels don't understand the system and the structure of it, so that you do tie the pay increases to a clear E&C metric that can be translated into whatever percentage is determined reasonable by the company. You don't want it too low that it would indicate that E&C is not important. I think anywhere from possibly 10 to 20% annually could be considered, so that you do give it an importance in the considerations of performance reviews. I don't know if anybody else has anything else to add with that.
Can you guys give an example of how the continuous feedback performance evaluation works?
Hey, Casey, I can take that one. So here at BAE Systems, we've got a program called Partner for Performance, and it's a pilot program right now. And so the intent is to, at a periodic basis, provide feedback to employees on their performance. So they, at the beginning of the year, you establish the frequency of the conversations, you establish separate goals, and part of that is the how things are being conducted. We've got ethical principles of honesty, accountability, respect, and that all wraps into that conversation. So at a minimum, they meet on a quarterly basis, the supervisor and the employee, and talk through their objectives and how they're accomplishing those. So you've got that feedback that's going on in a continuous fashion. So it's important, though, to make sure that your managers are trained and they're equipped to have that conversation. So there is training that's done on that, and so far it seems to be working well. We'll see how that plays out over the course of time. So it's that continuous feedback on the what piece and the how. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we have a question here. So for leaders' self-assessment, is there any guide you have that can be shared?
This is Bob. So I have seen self-assessment guides. They are not part of our paper, but I've seen self-assessment guides out there, and I don't have it at the top of my screen, or I don't have top of my fingertips. if somebody wants to contact me, I can try to find it. But in the report, and Tiffany was referring to this, we did have an example of a company that did this informal evaluation. And this informal evaluation was framed around 3 questions, and those 3 questions can vary. But the idea was that a leader knew in advance that part of the performance evaluation discussion at the end of the year would incorporate these 3 questions. And so they were asked to come in and prepared to do a self-assessment when they went to have their conversations with their bosses. And the self-assessment was on 3 topics. So one of the questions, for example, was, during the last year, have you successfully communicated your support for our code of conduct and the values of compliance and integrity throughout your area of responsibility? And it's wasn't any more structured than that, but the idea is that the leader would have to be prepared to answer that question. That then prompted the leaders to make sure that they were prepared to answer that question, which then prompted them to work with their ethics and compliance person to make sure that they had a story to tell at the end of the year. And so that's just one question. There were 3. But the idea, and you'll find it in the case study, but the idea is that you can use these targeted questions as a way to prompt employees and leaders to take actions over the course of the year so they can be prepared to show how they demonstrated leadership in ethics and compliance and in the course of the annual performance evaluation review, or whenever it is that these performance evaluation discussions take place.
Yeah, that's great, Bob. This is Tiffany. You can do a great Google search on what some other companies have done. What we've done within our own organization does keep it pretty simple within 3 quadrants. We discuss, the employer leader will discuss what they feel have been their strengths over the past year or past quarter, and then maybe what have been weaknesses or mistakes that they would like to reflect on, and then 3rd quadrant being setting goals for the future. And I think to tailor this to your own organization, you can also, how do you just insert questions in there that would reflect your own company values? So everybody has about 3 to 5 or so values that are specific to their company or organization. So you can tailor these other assessments that you may find anywhere to really reflect your company's values.
Great, thank you. So I do have another question from someone. They said that my company is updating our performance evaluation reviews at this time. Should I suggest E&C considerations now or wait until HR gets further into the process?
Thanks, Casey. This is Marisa. Excuse me. So if they're in the process of doing it now, I would say it's a great opportunity to jump in and get involved and see how you can help with that process. And through that, start to talk about where you can insert ethics and compliance into any part of the review. So the earlier you can get in and get that conversation going, the better. Even if your organization isn't actually redoing their review right now or updating it, it's still worth having that conversation to at least put the bug in the ear of the HR team that you're looking to make this change when they are ready.
This is Kim, and I would agree with that 100%, Marisa. We had redone our performance evaluation a couple of years ago and got into the discussions early on. HR, will typically have some type of a system that is being used and rolled out to people. And if you wait, you run the risk of not being able to get the changes made that you might want. So definitely get in there early.
And this is Bob. I would just add that sometimes, depending on your organization, you might have a great working relationship with HR, but in some places, HR might be protective of their unique role in the whole performance evaluation process. So you have to be able to come up with a story of why it's important to integrate ethics and compliance, which is something that Marisa spoke about. If it's useful in the process to share this best practice paper with them to make your argument, feel free to do so. Anything that can get you in the door to be part of the conversation earlier rather than later is good.
Great. Well, thank you again to the working group team for your hard work on this report. And thank you all for joining the call today. We hope that you enjoy the presentation and that you will consider joining an ECI working group in the future. I do actually have 2 new working groups that are starting. They'll be starting in late April. I have E&C in unconscious bias, and then compliance auditing and monitoring. Again, these are limited to members only. They are led by your E&C peers. Organizational and fellow members are included, so they're free. Individual members can elect to participate in it for a small fee. But just again, they are about 6 to 8 months, 1 call per month. But if anyone is interested in joining, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is casey@ethics.org, casey@ethics.org. But thank you all, and I hope you enjoyed it and have a wonderful day.